Hello student, how are you all? I hope you all are alright. Today we are going to study the Age of Milton. As earlier we have completed all the previous reading like about Shakespeare and Old English and about Chaucer's. Now today we will read about the Age of Milton, that is from 1625 to 1616. What we are going to study? We are going to study about the Age of Milton. Okay, we are going to about Age of Milton. The growth of Puritanism as a moral and social force, its establishment as a controlling power in the state, and the religious and political struggles by which these were accompanied for the student of the literature of Milton's age, the principal feature of his history. At the time of the Reformation, though the counsel of the moral moderate man prevailed, there were not wanting those of more radical cast of mind who were dissatisfied with the religious settlement, accompanied by Archbishop Parker and his colleagues, because they held that the Church of England as organized by them did not differ sufficiently from the Church of Rome, the true descendants of Wycliffe and Lollard, and now greatly influenced by a famous John Calvin of Geneva. These dissentients, while in many ways they failed to agree among themselves, were at one in their hostility to the episcopal form of ecclesiastical government and to the retention in the creeds and public worship of the national church of many ideas and ceremonies which they regarded as remnants of popery. They also advocated very strict views concerning life and conduct, and thus came to be called Puritans, a name which appears to have originated about the years of Shakespeare's birth or shortly after, and was at first used in derision, though it was soon accepted as a mere descriptive term. While the encompassing spirit of this party spread steadily among the English middle class during the reign of James I, it was till the time of his successor that Puritanism emerged as a great national power. A combination of causes now led to its practical success: the fast-growing flippancy and profligacy of the upper classes, by drawing toward it the sympathies of serious men of various shades of opinion, greatly increased its moral and social influence. The high-handed policy of Laud and his determination to enforce his will by persecution, meanwhile precipitated a fierce conflict within the religious world and brought all the enemies of episcopacy into line. Then came the monstrous encroachments of Charles upon the rights of the commons and the constitutional privileges of the English people. Their keen sense of supremacy of God as the ruler of rulers and the prerogatives of the individual conscience made the Puritans intolerant of earthly tyranny in the form. Thus Puritanism became a political as well as moral and religious force, and at a very critical time the great custodian and defender of our Jeopardism liberties after a stormy period of civil war. It triumphed with the triumph of Oliver Cromwell, and during the few years of the Commonwealth it was supreme. Within its range, the influence of Puritanism upon the tone of temper of English life and thought was profound. The spirit which it introduced was fine and noble, but it was hard and stern. We admire the Puritan's integrity and uprightness, but we deplore his fantasism, his moralness and narrowness of his outlook and sympathies. He was the He was an intense and God-fearing but illiberal and unreasonable man. While in the light of conditions of the time we can make the fullest allowance for which violence and extreme reaction against prevailing abuses, we are still bound to admit that his was one-sided and unwholesome view of world. For in his preoccupation with moral and spiritual things, he generally neglected and often expressly denounced the science and art, the knowledge and beauty which give value to secular life. To the extent of its power, Puritanism destroyed human culture and sought to confine literature within the circumscribed field of its own particular interest. While fatal to art, it was thus almost fatal to literature. It was only here and there that a writer arose who was able to absorb all its extent while transcending its limitation. This was emphatically the case with Milton, the greatest product of Puritanism in our literature. He in whose genius and work, however, the moral and religious influence of Puritanism are combined with the generous culture of the Renaissance. Now we will read about the what we are going to read about is about, first of all, we have to delete this. One second, it's over. Now we are going to read about Milton's life. What we are going to read about? Milton's life. Okay, so John Milton was born in Bread Street, Cheapside, London in 9th December 1608, or some 4 years before Shakespeare's retirement to Stratford. His father, though thought strongly Puritan in his sympathies, was none the less lover of literature and art, and the child enjoyed all the advantages of the cultivated home. He was educated at St. Paul's School and a Christ's College, Cambridge, where he remained 7 years, taking his BA in 1629 and his MA in 1632. His systematical study did not, however, close with the close of his college course. Realizing that he could not conscientiously enter the church for which he had been intended, and feeling no call to any other profession, he decided to give himself up entirely to self-culture and poetry. Fortunately, his father was in a financial position to further his wishes, and on leaving Cambridge, he accordingly took up his abode in the country house of the family and at Houghton, Buckinghamshire, some 17 miles from London. While a boy at school, as himself tells us, his books and kept him out of bed till midnight. At the university, he has shown the same untiring devotion to learning, and how during 6 years of almost interrupted seclusion he was able to pursue his studies. His studious ways was undisturbed. Building steadily upon the firm foundation he had already laid, Milton thus became a very great scholar. His point must be carefully marked, not only because in the breadth and accuracy of his erudition he stands head and shoulder above all of others poets, but also because his learning everywhere nourishes and interpenetrates his poetic work. Having now reached his 13th year, he resolved to complete his studies by travel. He therefore left London in May 1638 and went to wed the Paris to Italy, whence, however, he was prematurely recalled by news of his critical state of things at home. While I was preparing to pass over into Sicily and Greece, he writes, the melancholy intelligence which I received of the civil commotions in England made me alter my purpose. for I thought it best to be traveling for my amusement abroad while my fellow citizens were fighting for liberty at home. He was back in London in August 1639 after an absence of 15 months, and from 1640 onward was increasingly active as a supporter of the Puritan cause against the royalists. As a pamphleteer, he became indeed one of the great pillars of that cause, and on the establishment of Commonwealth was appointed Latin Secretary to the Committee for Foreign Affairs. In 1643, he married Mary Powell, the young daughter of the royalist, but the union proved a most unhappy one. Early 1653, a terrible calamity overtook him. His sight, which had long been failing, was now ruined entirely by overstress of work, and he became totally blind. 3 years later, he married again, but his wife Catherine Woodcock died within 15 months. On the restoration of the monarchy, Milton was arrested and 2 of his books were publicly burnt by the hangman. But he was soon released and permitted to drop into political obscurity. He was now poor and lonely as well as blind. He felt bitterly the failure of the cause for which he had toiled so hard and sacrificed so much, and though his third wife Elizabeth Minshul brought comfort to his declining years, he was greatly distressed by the unfilial conduct of his daughters by his first marriage. It was in darkness and sorrows, therefore, that he now turned back upon the ambitious poetical design which he had cherished many years before and had long set aside at the call of practical duty. His Paradise Lost was published in 1667, Paradise Regained and Samson Agonist together in 1671. 3 years later, on 8th November 1674, Milton died. Now we are going to read about what we are going to read about. We are going to read about at this time, you all my viewer, please like, subscribe the channel and share it as much as you can to one who are preparing for examination and their subject is English literature. Now we are going to read about Milton's earlier poetry. Milton's earlier poetry. Milton's earlier poetry. Milton's work falls naturally into 4 periods. The first is college period, closing with the end of his Cambridge career in 1632. Second is Horton period, closing with his departure for the continent in 1638, and the period of his prose writing from 1640 to 1660, and the late poetic period or period of his great achievement. So we are going to divide Milton's work. First, the college period. Second is college period. Second is Horton period. And third is the period of his prose writing. The period of his prose writing. And the fourth is the late poetic period. The late poetic poetic period. Okay, it is also called the period of his great achievement. Okay, so we are going to the page number Milton's earlier poetry. Okay, his college poems, Latin and English, are for the most part simply a young man's experiment work, and while interesting to the special student as the expression of his genius during its maturity, they have little other importance. To this statement, however, one exception must be made. One exception must be made in favor of the ode on the morning of Christ's nativity, which, though far from perfect and in places sadly marred by conceits and inequalities of style, is still a very remarkable production for a poet of 21. To the Horton period, on the other hand, belong four minor poems of such beauty and power that even if Paradise Lost had never been written, they would have sufficed to put their author high among the greater gods of English song. El Allegro and Second Penseroso, 1633, Comus, 1634, and Lycidas, 1637. Each of these may, of course, be enjoyed to the full of its own sake, but for the student, the most significant thing about them is that, read in the order of their writing, they show that during these years of thoughtful leisure, a profound change was taking place in the poet's mind. I have said in Milton's work, the moral and religious influence of Puritanism was blended with the generous culture of the Renaissance. It was this combination of elements which gave its distinctive quality to his greatness poetry. He could never have written as he did had either of them been wanting, but from his earlier poetry we now learn that he began to write chiefly under the inspiration of the learning and art of the Renaissance. The Puritan element was at first quite subordinate, and as it gradually gained its strength and depth till it became at the last of the dominant element. Thus, in El Allegro and Second Penseroso, with their charming contrasted picture of a man, nature, and art as seen through the medium of mood, in the one case of gladness and in other of melancholy, there is a little that is characteristically Puritan and a good deal that is really un-Puritan. For the poet dwells frankly upon the pleasure of romance and rustic sport, upon the delights of the playhouse and the Greek drama, and upon the beauty of church architecture and music, all of which things were to the religious fanatic object of uncompromising hatred. Then with Comus we mark a distinct stage in the development of Milton's mind, thus far latent. Only the Puritan spirit now makes its influence felt, that not alone in the poet's increased earnest but also in the specific quality of his moral teaching. On the literary side, this work to belong to Renaissance, for it is example of that type of drama which is called masque, which had been brought into country from Italy, and which had ever since been extremely popular at the court and among the nobility. The Milton should be willing to adopt. It is proof that he was still far from sharing the intense hostility of Puritan party to everything connected with the drama. But though he wrote in the form of narrative art, he filled them with the strenuous moral spirit and meaning. For his simple story of the lady lost in the woods, lured away by Comus and his band of revelers, and rescued by her brothers with the help of attendant spirit and the river knife, he is a patent allegory of virtue attacked by sensuality and conquering by divine aid. Here then we see the two streams of influence by which Milton's genius was fed, running together, and not that while the drama is loaded with classical learning and the nobility of its tone and the super faith in God which is expressed through it testify to the growing power of the religious inspiration over the poet's thought. Finally, in Lycidas was a Puritanism which is politically and ecclesiastical as well as spiritual and ethical. The monody of the death of Milton's college friend Edward King, this like Spencer Astrophel is in the conventional style of the classic pastoral elegy. In form, therefore, it belongs with commas to the Renaissance, but the religious accent in it throughout is unmistakable Puritan, while its famous attack upon the corrupt church and the hireling clergy of the time openly proclaims Milton's adherence to the Puritan cause. Thus, through these earlier poems, we can trace the steady growth of the religious element in Milton's mind. The learning and the art of the Renaissance were not abandoned by him, but they were moral and more used for the service of a Puritan philosophy of life. Now we are going to read about what we are going to read about is Milton's prose writing. Milton prose writing. Milton prose writing. On his return to England from the continent, Milton, then in his 31 year, threw himself into the fierce controversies of the hour, and thus, in his own words, embarked on troubled sea of noises and hoarse disputes. The ambition to write a great epic poem had already taken shape in his mind, but this laid aside in order that he might give all his strength and industry to the performance of what he conceived to be a great public duty. Involved in political and religious controversies, he thus returned from the poetry entirely, and for of the next 20 years continued active as a writer of prose. When we remember that Milton was incomparably the greatest poet of his age, and that in the very prime of his manhood, and during a space of time almost equal to the whole period of Shakespeare's dramatic activities, he produced to all told about a dozen sonnets, we can form some idea of what literature must have lost thou his preoccupation with temporary matters. His prose works are not today very interesting in themselves, nor indeed do they make very agreeable reading, for though they are often filled with noble earnestness and are redeemed by occasional bursts of splendid eloquence, they are too often marred by the coarseness of phrase and the intense bitterness of temper, which were the prevailing characteristics of the polemical literature of their time. Moreover, their style is heavy and cumbrous. Milton himself said that they were the work of his left hand, and we can learn from almost every page that his left hand did not possess the coming of his right. The long trailing sentences, the involved construction, the parentheses, the Latin inversions, all in fact show that when Milton wrote, modern English prose had not yet come into existence. One of these treatises, however, stands altogether apart, a great and noble Areopagitica, directed against an order of parliament which established a censorship of books. This is essentially a plea for freedom of thought and speech. and it should be ready to every lover of literature and intellectual liberty. Milton's later poetry. Now we are going to read about Milton's. Okay, this color is fine. Milton's later poetry. Later poetry. It was not till the restoration of the monarchy drove him into private life and obscurity that Milton found leisure to accomplish the immense task which year by year he had kept in the background of his mind. Now in Paradise Lost, he produced our greatest English poem. It is in the study of this stupendous masterpiece of intellectual energy and creative power that the full significance of the combination of qualities of his work of which we have spoken becomes apparent. The inspiration and the subject matter of the poem alike come from Milton's Puritanism. Paradise Lost is written as an exposition of his theology. Upon the foundation of the theology, it undertakes to assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to man. But if a thinker and moralist, he now belonged completely to Puritanism. As an artist, he had not ceased to belong to the Renaissance, and he, in its form and style, machinery and method, the poem everywhere takes us back to Milton's avowed model and great epics of classical antiquity, while the vast and varied learning which is built into its fabric shows how fondly in the barrenness and loneliness of his old age he recalled the whole secular studies of his happy earlier days. Now then the Puritan in Milton had not killed the humanist with the zeal for righteous and strenuous moral purpose which pertained to the one. There were still blended the love of learning and passion for beauty which were characteristics of the other. The Milton should have written the greatest regular epic poem in any modern in literature, and should have written it not on a classical but on theological subject and a vehicle of Christian teaching. In thus one fact of capital importance in the consideration of his work. In Paradise Lost he set forth the revolt of Satan against God, the war in heaven, the fall of rebels angel and creation of the world and man, the temptation of Eve and Adam and their expulsion from Eden. Yet while his central purpose was to show how man's first disobedience brought his sin and death in its train, it is characteristic of him that he does not close on the note of evil triumphant but prophetically introduces the divine work of redemption. Though in this way he had apparently completed his original scheme, however, he was afterward led to add a sequel in fourth book, the substances of which was provided by the temptation of Christ in the wilderness, but while not without its occasional pages of sublimity and the tenderness. Paradise Regained seems most of modern readers a very slight thing beside its gigantic predecessors. The dramatic poem Samson Agonist, Samson the Wrestler, crowns the labors of these closing years. In this, as Paradise Lost, Milton applies the forms of classic art to the treatment of the biblical subject, for the work of fashioned strictly upon the principle of Greek tragedy, while the matter is of course derived from the fate of Samson among the Philistines. This subject had been Milton's thought many years before, when he had casting about for a theme for this epic, but it had been discarded in favor of the fall of man. He returned to now in all probability because he saw in the hero an image both of himself, blind, disappointed and surrounded by enemies, and the Puritan cause overwhelmed by might of its foes. Characteristics of poetry. characteristics of Milton's poetry. Okay. After Shakespeare, Milton is greatest English poet, which means that he is the greatest English poet outside the drama. Moreover, in the almost unanimous judgment of the critics, he is to be regarded as one of the 3 or 4 supreme poets of the world. In him we have wonderful union of intellectual power and creative power, both at their highest. He is also consummate literary artist whose touch is as sure in delicate detail as in vast general effect. While many qualities thus go to the making of his work, however, the one which we must naturally think of, and which indeed we have come to denote by the epithet Miltonic, in his sublimity. He is the most sublime of English poets, and our one acknowledged master of what Matthew Arnold calls grand style. His sustained majesty and thought and diction he is unrevealed. His descriptive power too is astonished, as we can learn for ourselves by turning, for example, to the scene of hell in the opening book of Paradise Lost. And while he was entirely lacking in the true dramatic sense, the magnificent debate in the Council of Fallen Angels and the whole conduct of the temptation of Eve show an extraordinary insight into motive and character. Though in theory an epic poem is supposed to be quite impersonal, Milton's epic is throughout instinctive with the spirit of the man himself. Narrow he often is. He is often hard and austere, but there is an intensity of individuality in everything he writes which is singularly impressive, and the loftiness of his temper and passion, net moral earnestness, make us feel as we read that we are indeed in the presence of one whose soul was like a star and dwelt apart. In connection with the technical side of his poetry, a special note should be taken of the great and varied beauty of his style and versification. His blank verse is particular deserve the closest study, though this form, as we now know, had long been used in the drama. It had not thus far been adopted for any important non-dramatic poem. Milton was therefore making an experiment when he took as the measure of Paradise Lost English heroic verse without rhyme. Of this measure he remains our greatest master. So this is all about the Milton's poetry and at the age of Milton. Now in the next video we will go about the other poets and prose during the Milton's age.